The shock inside Windsor did not begin with a shout, a scandalous headline, or a public accusation. It began with a quiet request placed before Prince William, a request so personal, so loaded with memory and pain, that the room seemed to change the moment Diana's name was spoken. Camilla had tried to claim access to Diana's private personal archive, and William was left staring at the words in disbelief. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The prince did not react at once. He read the first page again, then the second, and then the line that made the air tighten around him. Diana's private personal archive, a guarded collection of letters, recordings, handwritten notes, charity files, family memories, and personal reflections, was not simply papers. It was the part of her life that had escaped the public storm, the part protected from cameras, courtiers, and history's cold hands. That mattered, because Diana's voice had already been used by the world in life, and William knew that in death, even silence could be taken from her if no one stood in the way. Camilla's request was plain. She wanted access and partial authority over the archive, arguing that it belonged under the wider royal household's historical record, meaning the official collection of documents used to preserve and explain the monarchy's past. She saw order. She saw control. She saw a way to protect the crown's version of events before anyone else could shape it. But William saw something far more painful. He saw a trespass. He saw a hand reaching into the last private room his mother had left behind. A sealed inventory came attached to the file, and that was where the request turned from uncomfortable to explosive. Several items had been marked by Diana herself as personal, not institutional. A phrase so simple that no palace lawyer could soften it. A palace aide watched the future king lower the document onto the table carefully, as if the paper carried a heartbeat. He did not throw it down. He did not push it away. He placed it gently, because even in anger, Diana's name demanded tenderness. Camilla, far from that room but present in every word, had forced a question no one wanted spoken aloud. Could the monarchy claim a woman's memory because she had once belonged to it? William's silence became an answer. Shock hardened into resolve. And before the palace could decide what the archive meant to history, William had to face what it still meant to him as a son. Every royal crisis has names attached to it, but this one carried wounds. William was not just the heir protecting palace records. Camilla was not just the queen consort requesting access. Charles was not just a monarch watching another family fracture reopen. In that silent corridor of power, Diana's absence became more powerful than anyone standing inside it. The prince had become the emotional guardian of his mother's memory long before this request arrived. He understood the archive as more than history, more than papers stored under careful locks, more than a private collection waiting to be catalogued. It was Diana's final protected voice, the part of her life that had not been shaped by palace statements or public judgment. That mattered because William knew how easily pain could be turned into record, and how easily record could be turned into control. Camilla saw the same archive through another lens. To her, the royal household's official control meant the crown should manage sensitive materials tied to its past, especially anything that could reopen old wounds or challenge the monarchy's carefully guarded image. The queen consort believed order would protect the institution. William believed that same order could bury his mother all over again. Between them stood Charles, and his silence cut deeper than any command. The king listened to his wife's argument for structure, then watched his son's visible grief harden into something colder. He did not rush to defend Camilla. He did not immediately comfort William. He simply remained still, and that stillness became its own kind of judgment. Catherine felt the cost before anyone explained it. When William returned from the meeting, she saw his face and understood that this was not paperwork. It was betrayal wearing official language. The princess knew him well enough to recognize the look he carried when private pain had been forced into public duty. He did not need to say much. Diana's name had already said enough. Then came the detail that changed the temperature of the whole dispute. A private note from Diana's archive was said to contain her own instructions about what should never be used for institutional defense, meaning any palace effort to protect reputation by using personal materials. That note mattered, because it suggested Diana had anticipated this exact danger, the risk that her most private words might one day be turned into royal armor. Camilla's team quietly prepared a heritage argument, claiming the archive belonged to the monarchy's broader historical memory, while William's advisors began searching for proof that Diana had separated her personal voice from royal ownership. The emotional lines were drawn before anyone spoke openly, and the archive became the battlefield no one could pretend was neutral. But the conflict did not appear from nowhere. It had been waiting beneath the surface since one unforgettable royal moment changed everything. The palace would later pretend this crisis began with a legal request. It did not. The first crack appeared months earlier, during a private memorial ceremony for Diana's humanitarian work, when one sentence spoken behind closed doors turned grief into suspicion. That moment became the trigger, the wound, the point everyone remembered when Camilla finally reached for the archive. William had arrived at the private Kensington memorial, expecting reflection, not calculation. The ceremony was meant to honor Diana's charity legacy, the part of her life built around compassion, public service, and wounded people who had found comfort in her attention. A memorial ceremony, in plain terms, is a formal gathering held to remember someone's life and impact, and this one carried a painful weight because Diana's work belonged to people far beyond the palace gates. Yet behind closed doors, Camilla suggested that certain private Diana materials should be reviewed for the crown's protection, and the room changed. The queen consort did not shout. She did not need to. The phrase was calm, controlled, and devastating. It landed badly because the day was supposed to honor Diana's human work, not reopen old palace defenses or manage the uncomfortable pieces of history. William heard it and felt the old tension return, like a door inside him had been forced open. To Camilla, the archive was becoming a tool, a record, a possible shield against whatever pain the past might still contain. To the prince, it was his mother's guarded voice, the part of Diana that had survived every attempt to explain her, judge her, and own her. Catherine noticed the change in him before anyone else did. The princess saw his expression harden, and later, when they were alone, William admitted the phrase had felt less like a passing comment and more like a warning. Diana had been honored in public, but behind private walls, her words were already being measured for use. Then came the detail that would later become impossible to ignore. A courtier recorded Camilla's phrase in a private briefing note, a quiet palace document prepared to preserve what had been said during sensitive gatherings. That note created a paper trail, and once the archive claim arrived, it connected the ceremony directly to the request. Even the memorial program carried its own haunting irony. It included a quote from Diana about private truth, a line chosen to celebrate her honesty, but suddenly, it felt like a boundary being tested by people who should have understood it. By the time the formal claim crossed William's desk, he no longer saw an isolated request. He saw a plan that had been forming for months, one that began the moment Camilla turned remembrance into protection. And when belief hardened into certainty, the next meeting could not remain polite for long. The confrontation came quietly, which made it worse. No raised voices carried through the corridor. No door slammed at first. William entered the private room with the archive request in his hand, and Camilla was already waiting, composed, watchful, certain that the conversation would become a negotiation. She did not yet understand that the prince had arrived with a decision, not a question. William placed the file between them, and for a few seconds, neither of them touched it. That silence mattered, because this was no longer a disagreement about storage, family records, or palace procedure. It had become a test of whether Diana's most private words could be pulled into royal control by the very institution she had once struggled against. Camilla knew the weight of the room, but the queen consort still believed calm authority could turn the moment in her favor. A private room like this, in royal terms, was where sensitive family matters were handled away from official committees, meaning no broad staff presence, no easy witnesses, and no quick escape behind formal language. Charles remained nearby, but outside the direct exchange, and that choice changed everything. The king was close enough to understand the danger, yet distant enough to leave his wife and son facing each other without protection. William spoke first, and his calm carried more force than anger. Diana's private archive, he told Camilla, could not be treated as palace property. It was not an institutional asset. It was not a defensive shield. It was not a chapter the crown could edit because the past felt uncomfortable. Camilla answered with the kind of restraint that made her words sharper. History, she said, could not be protected by emotion alone. William's face tightened at the implication, because to him, emotion was not weakness here. It was the only honest measure of what had been done, and what must never be done again. Then the prince reached into the file and produced the inventory note marked personal, not institutional. The phrase struck harder than any accusation because it came from Diana herself. Camilla could argue with advisors, she could challenge interpretations, she could question control, but she could not easily step over those words without revealing exactly what William feared. The queen consort pushed the file away, not violently, but enough for a pen to roll across the table, and that small movement chilled the room. A simple object crossing polished wood became the sound of patience breaking. William did not move to retrieve it. Camilla did not speak at once. The refusal had landed. The meeting was over in everything but form. Yet by ending the conversation, William had triggered something larger, because now the palace had to answer the question everyone had avoided. Who held the authority to decide what belonged to Diana, and what belonged to the crown? Once the confrontation ended, the argument moved from grief into power, and every hidden mechanism of the crown began to turn. Power inside the monarchy rarely announces itself. It waits in signatures, custody clauses, old filing rules, and quiet men carrying keys to rooms most people never see. After William's refusal, the palace stopped speaking in feelings and started speaking in authority. But even then, one human face carried the weight of it all. Charles, reading the file alone and setting it down without a word. The king understood that this dispute had moved beyond a painful family argument. It now rested on custody records, meaning the written proof of who had legal or personal control over sensitive materials, and on Diana's own instructions about what belonged to the family rather than the institution. That distinction mattered because private family materials carried emotion, memory, and personal trust, while crown-held historical documents belonged to the official royal record, where they could be catalogued, interpreted, and sometimes used to defend the monarchy's image. William feared that once Diana's words entered that official machinery, her private boundaries would vanish beneath polished language. Camilla feared the opposite. The queen consort believed that uncontrolled materials could wound the monarchy again, not because every page was dangerous, but because even one sentence, lifted from grief and placed before the world, could reopen battles the palace had spent decades trying to bury. Archivists and legal advisors began reviewing the inventory, studying each line to decide whether Camilla's claim had any standing under household authority, which meant the internal power used to manage royal properties, records, and family-linked documents. Charles read their early findings alone, and the strain showed in the way he paused over Diana's name. He was not only judging a file, he was measuring his wife's position against his son's pain, and the silence around him made the choice feel heavier. Then came the discovery that shifted the balance. A senior archivist identified a locked cabinet entry that Diana had personally separated from public royal records, marking it apart from materials meant for official preservation. The locked cabinet was not just storage, it was a boundary. It said that some pieces of a life were never meant to become palace evidence. Soon after, the custody file revealed a handwritten notation stating that the archive was intended to remain under restricted family protection, not queen consort oversight. Those words weakened Camilla's argument with brutal simplicity. William's advisors saw proof. Camilla's team saw a wall rising. Charles saw the cost of both. The palace could still pretend this was procedure, but everyone close to the file knew better. Diana's private voice had left instructions, and those instructions were now pushing back from the page. The legal review weakened Camilla's claim, but the emotional consequences were only beginning. And when the first decision moved through the palace, no one felt the impact more sharply than the woman who had made the claim. The first consequence was not public. It was a closed door, a restricted file, and Camilla sitting alone after being told that access had been denied. For the first time since the request began, the Queen Consort was not arguing with William across a table. She was facing the meaning of rejection in silence, and the silence was sharper than any speech. Camilla received the decision in a small private sitting room, and for one controlled moment, she gave nothing away. The aide explained that her request for access and partial authority over Diana's private archive had been blocked pending final family approval. That phrase mattered, because final family approval meant the last decision would not rest with household staff, not with advisors, and not with anyone trying to protect the palace from discomfort. It would rest with those closest to Diana's legacy, especially the son who had drawn the line. William's position had become the guiding rule. His mother's private materials were to remain protected from institutional use, meaning they could not be turned into official palace arguments, defensive briefings, or carefully shaped historical explanations. To him, this was not revenge. It was protection. It was the difference between preserving Diana's memory and allowing the monarchy to take one last piece of her. Camilla kept her expression still until the aide left, but the stillness did not mean peace. It meant restraint under pressure. Charles tried to soften the blow, choosing his words carefully, reminding her that the denial was not meant as personal humiliation. Yet Camilla heard something else beneath his attempt at comfort. She heard defeat becoming visible. She heard a private rejection preparing to become public judgment. The king saw that pain settle over her, and he understood that the palace had protected Diana's archive while creating a new wound inside his own marriage. Then the restrictions began moving through senior staff. A list was circulated naming Diana's correspondence, recordings, and private family notes as off-limits. Correspondence meant personal letters and written exchanges, the kind of material that could carry a person's most unguarded thoughts. Recordings meant preserved spoken words, even more dangerous, because a voice can make the past feel alive again. William went further. He asked that no summary of the archive be prepared for anyone outside the approved custody circle, a small group allowed to know what the materials contained. That request signaled a total defensive wall. No excerpts, no briefings, no softened version for royal convenience. Camilla's claim had been blocked, but the denial created a fracture that protocol could not cover. The palace had made its move, but the true turning point would come only when William and Charles finally spoke without anyone standing between them. There are conversations no monarchy can stage manage. No aides, no advisors, no careful notes taken for the record, just a father, a son, and the name that had shaped both their lives in opposite ways. When William sat across from Charles that night, Diana was not a memory in a file. She was the silence between them. The prince had already won the first battle by blocking Camilla's access, but victory did not feel like relief. It felt heavier than defeat, because now the decision had moved from palace procedure into the most painful corner of his family's past. Charles understood that too. The king knew the archive had become a test of whether Diana's private humanity could survive palace control, meaning whether her personal words, feelings, and guarded memories could remain protected from the institution that once surrounded her. That mattered, because if the crown could claim even this final private space, then no boundary around Diana would ever be safe. William did not speak like a man seeking revenge. He spoke like a son carrying a duty no one else could carry for him. Protecting the archive, he told Charles, was not about punishing Camilla, not about reopening old wounds for the sake of anger, and not about turning Diana into a weapon against the present. It was responsibility. It was the promise every child makes in silence when a parent is gone, that what remains sacred will not be handed over to those who do not understand its cost. Charles listened, and for once, the monarch could not hide behind royal caution. He heard the pain beneath William's discipline, and that pain demanded more than a careful answer. The king admitted that some parts of the past could not be managed into comfort. Some memories could not be polished until they stopped hurting. Some truths had to remain untouched, because touching them for institutional protection would only prove why they needed guarding in the first place. William saw something rare in his father's face then: surrender, not weakness, but recognition. The prince asked for a permanent written order protecting the archive from any future palace defense or reputational campaign, meaning no one could use Diana's personal materials to shield the monarchy from criticism or reshape public memory. Charles knew what agreeing would cost. It would anger Camilla, limit the household, and place Diana's private voice beyond the reach of royal strategy forever. But refusing would cost him something greater: his son's trust. So the king agreed to support restricted family custody, a protected arrangement keeping the archive within approved family control. Father and son were not healed in that moment, but they were aligned. And once the story reached beyond the palace gates, Diana's archive became more than a family dispute. It became a national emotional reckoning. By morning, the palace could no longer contain the meaning of the archive dispute. Britain woke to a story that felt less like administration and more like grief reopened. One newspaper captured the mood with a stark front page, a black and white photograph of Diana beside the words, "Her voice stays private." In that moment, the public understood exactly what William had defended. The controlled palace acknowledgement was meant to sound calm, but it landed with force. Diana's private materials would remain under restricted family protection, meaning only approved members of the family and trusted custodians could access them, and no wider royal office could treat them as ordinary historical files. That mattered because the archive was no longer being seen as paper. It had become proof of a deeper question: whether a woman who had given so much of herself to the world still had the right to keep part of herself untouched. Broadcasters quickly framed the story as a battle over memory, legacy, and the limits of royal authority. Royal authority, in simple terms, meant the power the monarchy uses to manage its homes, records, duties, and public image. But this time, that power had met something stronger than protocol. It had met public emotion. William was seen leaving Kensington with a grave expression, and the moment carried more meaning than any prepared statement. The prince looked like a son carrying his mother's final boundary, not an heir celebrating a win. That mattered, because his success came wrapped in suffering. He had protected Diana, but only by being forced to fight for her privacy all over again. Camilla remained out of sight, and her absence became its own message. Commentators read it as defeat, not because she had spoken publicly, but because silence sometimes tells the world exactly where the pain has landed. The queen consort had tried to bring the archive closer to palace control, and now the public mood had turned firmly toward the woman whose private voice had almost been claimed. Outside Kensington Palace, a quiet crowd gathered with white flowers and handwritten notes thanking William for protecting Diana's voice. One note said simply, "A mother's words belong to her children." Then a broadcaster gave the sentence that carried across the day. "This is not just about records. This is about whether a woman's private truth belongs to history or to her children." Those words cut through every defense the palace might have offered. Public feeling settled around Diana's privacy, strong and unshaken, leaving the monarchy with one final verdict to deliver inside its own walls. The world had chosen its emotional side, but the final meaning of the crisis would be decided by what the family accepted after the noise faded. In the end, the archive did not become a trophy, a weapon, or a palace instrument. It remained what Diana had intended it to be: private, protected, and human. William's shock became resolve. Camilla's claim became a warning. Charles's hesitation became acceptance. And the monarchy learned that some doors must stay closed, not because history is afraid of them, but because love still guards what power cannot own. William understood the victory carried pain inside it. The final family decision confirmed that Diana's private personal archive would remain under restricted protection, separate from Camilla's authority and wider palace management. Restricted protection meant only approved family custodians could guard and review the materials, not palace offices seeking control or officials trying to shape history for comfort. That mattered, because the archive held more than private papers. It held a woman's final boundary, a mother's unguarded voice, and a truth the institution could no longer touch without exposing its own hunger for control. The ruling created a new internal boundary inside the monarchy, a line saying personal legacy could not automatically be absorbed into royal institutional control. Royal institutional control meant the power of the crown to manage records, ceremonies, titles, and official narratives, But this time, that power stopped at Diana's name. William felt the burden lift slightly, not because the past had healed, but because his mother's private voice had been defended. The prince had not erased old grief. He had given it dignity. Camilla faced a different kind of ending. The queen consort was left to accept that authority has limits, especially when it reaches into sorrow that does not belong to her. Charles made that truth final when he signed the protective order quietly. A protective order, in simple terms, is a written command that sets firm legal or family limits around what can be accessed, used, or changed. For the king, the signature became more than procedure. It became his final acknowledgement that Diana's memory could not be rewritten by palace necessity. The archive returned to its locked custody, and Diana's marked instructions remained at the moral center of the decision, standing stronger than every argument built around reputation. This moment proved that the monarchy could command titles, rooms, ceremonies, and records, but it could not claim the most private parts of a woman who had already given the world everything she could. William's stand did not end the pain, but it changed what the pain meant. For Diana, the verdict was clear. Her voice remained hers, guarded by the son who refused to let history become another invasion. The door closed, the archive remained protected, and for the first time in this battle, silence finally felt like peace. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.